Long before the first human ships crossed the void between stars, another civilization had already risen, mastered the galaxy, and fallen into ruin so complete that its own descendants can barely comprehend what was lost. Its cities once outshone anything humanity would build in 10,000 years of expansion. Its wars reshaped the structure of reality itself. Today, its survivors are scattered across a handful of wandering craft worlds and hidden webway paths, a fraction of what they once were, haunted by a catastrophe they brought upon themselves. Who were the Aeldari before their fall, and what remains of them now demands an answer that begins not with their end, but with their extraordinary beginning. The Aeldari emerged as one of the oldest known intelligent species in the galaxy, their civilization reaching maturity while much of the wider cosmos remained in its infancy. Physically similar to humans in basic form, yet distinct in nearly every other respect, they were taller, more slender, and possessed reflexes, senses, and cognitive faculties that far exceeded baseline human capacity. Their lifespans, under proper conditions, extended across many centuries, and their relationship with the psychic dimension, known as the warp, was unlike that of any species before or since. Where humanity's psychic potential developed gradually and unevenly, the Aeldari were psychically attuned from the earliest stages of their civilization, their minds bound closely to the currents of the warp in ways that granted them extraordinary insight, extraordinary artistry, and ultimately extraordinary vulnerability. At the height of their power, the Aeldari Empire spanned a significant portion of the galaxy, its territory organized not through crude conquest, but through a civilization of staggering technological and cultural sophistication. Their mastery of the webway, a network of stable pathways running parallel to the treacherous currents of the warp, allowed instantaneous travel between worlds without the dangers faced by ships forced to cross open warp space. Their command of genetic science, energy manipulation, and psychic technology exceeded anything achieved before or since by any other known civilization. Aeldari cities were not merely built, but composed, structures grown and shaped with an artistry that treated architecture as a form of living sculpture, reflecting a culture in which aesthetic refinement was inseparable from function. Every aspect of Aeldari civilization during this period reflected the same underlying principle: that mastery of a craft, whether artistic, scientific, or martial, was inseparable from mastery of the self. Aeldari society organized itself loosely around specialized castes and lifelong pursuits, with individuals frequently devoting centuries to the perfection of a single discipline, whether the shaping of psychically resonant artwork, the cultivation of entire ecosystems, or the study of the warp itself. This capacity for sustained generational focus, impossible for shorter-lived species, allowed the Aeldari to achieve levels of refinement in their chosen fields that few other civilizations could hope to match, producing works of art, architecture, and technology that later ages would struggle even to properly comprehend, let alone replicate. This refinement, however, existed alongside another quality that would ultimately prove far more consequential. The Aeldari of this early empire pursued sensation with the same intensity they applied to art, science, and war. Freed from material scarcity by their advanced technology and possessed of psychic senses capable of experiencing pleasure, pain, and emotion with an intensity unknown to less attuned species, significant portions of Aeldari society drifted toward increasingly extreme forms of indulgence. What began as sophisticated pleasure-seeking evolved, over generations, into practices of escalating excess, as each new sensation was pursued more intensely than the last in a civilization that had already mastered every conventional form of experience. This slow cultural drift, largely unnoticed or dismissed by those living through it, was steadily reshaping the psychic imprint the Aeldari species left upon the warp itself, a consequence none among them fully understood until it was far too late to reverse. Before this decline reached its catastrophic conclusion, the Aeldari had already fought and endured the most devastating conflict the galaxy had yet witnessed, a war so vast and so destructive that its true scope remains difficult to reconstruct, even from the fragments that survive. This conflict, remembered as the War in Heaven, pitted the Aeldari and their allies against the Necrontyr, an ancient species bound in service to a group of powerful, malevolent entities known as the Citan. The war's origins lay in the older rivalry between the Aeldari and the Necrontier's masters, beings who fed upon the psychic and physical vitality of other species, and who viewed the Aeldari's growing dominance as an obstacle to be eliminated. The war in heaven unfolded across the galaxy for millennia, a conflict of a scale that dwarfed nearly every war fought in the ages since. The Necrontyre, unable to match the Aeldari in psychic power or cultural sophistication, pursued an alternative solution devised by their Citan masters: the transferal of Necrontyre consciousness into engineered, near-indestructible metallic bodies, trading mortality and biological vulnerability for durability that bordered on immortality. These transformed warriors, the Necrons, became instruments of a campaign designed not merely to defeat the Aeldari, but to methodically consume the galaxy's living worlds, harvesting their biological and psychic resources to sustain the hunger of the Citan. Facing an enemy that could not be worn down through conventional attrition, the Aeldari were forced to develop weapons and strategies of comparable extremity. Ancient records suggest they constructed devices capable of erasing entire star systems, tools of destruction so absolute that their use was considered a measure of last resort, even against an enemy as merciless as the Necrontyre. Other species, witnessing the devastation unfolding around them, were drawn into the conflict as well. Some fighting alongside the Aeldari against the growing Necron threat, others exploiting the chaos for their own purposes. Whole star systems were rendered permanently uninhabitable. Entire species were driven to extinction, their disappearance recorded only in the fragmentary and contested histories that later scholars would struggle to piece together. The war in heaven ultimately turned in favor of the Aeldari and their allies, though the victory came at staggering cost. A pivotal factor in this reversal was the internal fracturing of the Necron and Citan alliance itself. Facing catastrophic losses, the Necrontyre's leadership turned upon their Citan masters, employing a technology capable of dividing and imprisoning the Citan into shard-like fragments of their former power, breaking the coordinated strategic mind that had directed the Necron war effort. With their masters reduced to fractured remnants and their own species transformed into something closer to sentient machinery, the surviving Necrons withdrew into a state of self-imposed hibernation that would last for tens of millions of years, sealing themselves beneath the surface of countless worlds to await a future age they could not yet foresee. For the Aeldari, victory in the war in heaven did not bring the restoration many had hoped for. The war had devastated their empire, destroyed countless worlds, and left their civilization diminished in ways that would never fully be reversed. Yet even in the aftermath of such profound loss, the deeper cultural drift toward excess and indulgence that had begun generations earlier continued largely unchecked, as though the trauma of the war had only deepened the desire among many Aeldari to seek refuge in sensation rather than confront the underlying crisis building within their own civilization. This crisis reached its terrible conclusion many thousands of years later, in an event remembered by the Aeldari as the Fall. The pursuit of extreme sensation, sustained across countless generations by a species uniquely attuned to the psychic dimension, had steadily generated an immense reservoir of psychic energy within the warp, a concentration of desire, excess, and cruelty that grew in scale and coherence with each passing century. When this accumulated force finally achieved a form of independent consciousness, it manifested as an entity of overwhelming psychic power, a being that would come to be known as Slaanesh. The birth of this entity unleashed a cataclysm across Aeldari space that consumed the vast majority of their civilization within a matter of days. Entire populated worlds were engulfed. Billions of Aeldari perished or were consumed entirely, their souls drawn into the newly formed entity's domain within the warp. The empire that had once rivaled any civilization in galactic history was reduced almost instantaneously to a scattering of survivors. Those who escaped the fall did so through foresight, circumstance, or a willingness to abandon the culture that had led their species to ruin. Among the most significant of these survivors were populations who had already withdrawn from the excesses of Aeldari society before the catastrophe struck, having taken up residence aboard vast, self-sufficient vessels known as craftworlds, city-scale arcs capable of sustaining Aeldari civilization independent of any single world. When the fall struck, these craftworlds were among the few Aeldari settlements positioned to survive it. Their populations spared the immediate destruction that consumed the Aeldari homeworlds and the majority of their empire. In the aftermath, the Aeldari who survived aboard the craftworlds developed a rigorous new philosophy intended to prevent any repetition of the catastrophe that had destroyed their civilization. This philosophy, centered on the strict discipline of emotion and behavior, became known as the Path, a structured system in which individuals dedicate themselves entirely to a single role, skill, or emotional discipline for a defined period of their long lives, whether as a warrior, an artisan, a scholar, or countless other specializations, before setting that identity aside and moving to another. This constant, deliberate cycling of identity is intended to prevent the kind of unchecked emotional excess that led to the fall, ensuring that no individual becomes so consumed by any single passion, including the passion for war, that they lose themselves entirely to it. Those who follow the martial branch of this discipline, known as the Path of the Warrior, form the Craftworld's defenders, temporarily setting aside civilian identity to become highly skilled soldiers, before eventually returning to peaceful pursuits once their period of service concludes. Governance within the Craftworlds reflects this same underlying philosophy of restraint and specialization. Rather than concentrating authority in a single ruler, most Craftworlds are guided by councils composed of the most accomplished individuals across their various disciplines, with military, spiritual, and administrative authority distributed among those who have mastered the relevant path most completely. Certain individuals, having walked so many disciplines across their extended lives that the boundaries between paths begin to blur, eventually become seers, gifted with heightened psychic sensitivity to the currents of fate itself. These seers occupy a position of particular reverence within Craftworld society. Their guidance sought before any major undertaking, their warnings rarely ignored, for their insight into probability has, time and again, proven the difference between a Craftworld's survival and its destruction. Not all Aeldari survivors chose the disciplined isolation of the Craftworlds. Some, particularly those who had already embraced the pursuit of extreme sensation before the fall, continued to exist within the webway in scattered hidden enclaves known as the Dark City or Komarag, sustaining themselves through practices that mirror, in fractured and diminished form, the excesses that doomed their ancestors. These Aeldari, commonly called the Drukhari, maintain their continued existence through the deliberate infliction of suffering upon captives drawn from across the galaxy, a practice that sustains them against the slow spiritual consumption that continues to threaten any Aeldari touched by the legacy of the fall. Their society operates through a brutal and ever-shifting hierarchy of cabals, each led by an archon whose authority depends entirely on strength, cunning, and the ability to outmaneuver rivals within a civilization defined by perpetual internal conflict. Komaruk itself stands as a testament to the scale of what the Aeldari lost, and what a fraction of their descendants chose to preserve in its most corrupted form. Vast beyond easy measure, hidden entirely within the folds of the webway rather than open real space, the Dark City houses a population that, while diminished from the Empire's ancient height, still vastly outnumbers the combined population of every craftworld in existence. Raiding fleets launch from its hidden ports to strike targets across the galaxy, seizing captives to sustain the suffering economy upon which Drukhari society depends, before withdrawing again into the concealment of the webway before any organized retaliation can be mounted. It is a civilization built entirely upon the avoidance of the very fate its people fear most, sustaining itself through the suffering of others rather than confronting the deeper spiritual cost of their continued existence. A further population, distinct from both the Craftworlds and the Dark City, chose neither strict discipline nor indulgent excess, but a return to a simpler, more traditional way of life. These Aeldari, known as the Exodites, settled upon maiden worlds scattered across the galaxy long before the fall occurred, deliberately rejecting the technological and psychic excesses of the wider empire in favor of a pastoral, agrarian existence lived in close cooperation with the natural environment of their adopted worlds, often alongside massive domesticated reptilian creatures bred for labor, transport, and war. Isolated from the catastrophe that consumed their kin, the Exodites persist today as small, scattered communities, fiercely protective of their chosen worlds and generally content to remain apart from the wider currents of Aeldari politics and conflict. Beyond these three broad populations, dedicated orders of Aeldari mystics maintain traditions predating the catastrophe, devoting their existence to the study of fate itself and seeking to interpret and, where possible, influence the tangled threads of probability that shape the galaxy's future. These seers move between craft worlds and, on rare occasion, even into contact with the Exodites, carrying warnings and guidance drawn from visions few outside their order could safely withstand. Their counsel treated as among the most valuable resources remaining to a species that has learned, at ruinous cost, the danger of acting without foresight. Across all these surviving populations, a common thread persists, an acute and ever-present awareness of decline. The Aeldari species that once numbered in the untold trillions now survives in numbers a small fraction of its former scale. Its worlds reduced to a handful of craft worlds, hidden enclaves, and scattered outposts spread thinly across a galaxy that has largely moved beyond them. Where they once shaped the fate of the cosmos through direct dominion, the Aeldari of the present age operate through subtlety, manipulation, and carefully targeted intervention, influencing the course of galactic events from the margins rather than the center. This shift in strategy reflects a hard truth the Aeldari have been forced to accept. They no longer possess the numbers or resources to confront their enemies through direct, sustained warfare. Every warrior lost in battle represents an irreplaceable fraction of an already diminished population, a truth that shapes Aeldari military doctrine profoundly, favoring precision, speed, and calculated withdrawal over prolonged engagement. Aeldari forces from the craft worlds strike with overwhelming coordination and technological superiority, then vanish before their enemies can mount an effective response, a style of warfare built around the preservation of life rather than the attrition that defines so many other galactic conflicts. The Aeldari's relationship with the wider galaxy is further complicated by the sheer number of rival powers now competing for the same contested territories their ancestors once ruled outright. Where the ancient empire faced few genuine equals, the modern craft worlds must navigate a galaxy crowded with the sprawling imperium of man, the ever-shifting greater good espoused by the Tau, the newly stirring Necron dynasties awakening from their ancient slumber, and the endless predation of Orc warbands, all while remaining ever wary of the corrupting reach of chaos. The collective term for the warp entities, Slaanesh chief among them, born from or empowered by the excesses and passions of mortal civilizations. In this crowded and hostile environment, Aeldari diplomacy has become an instrument as vital as their weapons. Alliances formed and abandoned with ruthless pragmatism whenever the survival of a craft world or the fulfillment of a critical prophecy demands it, regardless of the cost to former allies. The Aeldari's current situation is further complicated by the emergence of a figure many among them believe represents their species' last true hope for survival, an entity known as Ynead, sometimes described as the god of the dead, said to be forming within the warp from the accumulated souls of Aeldari who have died since the fall, souls carefully gathered and preserved by dedicated priesthoods, rather than left to the predation of Slaanesh. According to the beliefs held by many Craftworld Aeldari, the eventual full awakening of Ynead is destined to bring about a final reckoning with Slaanesh, offering the possibility, however distant, of reclaiming what was lost and securing a future for a species that has spent 10,000 years merely surviving rather than thriving. Whether this prophecy will ever be fulfilled remains uncertain, and the divisions among the Aeldari themselves complicate any unified effort towards such a goal. Craftworld and Drukhari factions remain locked in mutual distrust, bordering on open hostility. The disciplined survivors of the path viewing their Dark City kin as a continuation of the very excess that caused the fall, while the Drukhari regard the Craftworld's rigid restraint as a fragile denial of their species' true nature. Even among the Craftworlds themselves, differing interpretations of tradition, strategy, and priority have produced significant divisions, with some populations favoring greater engagement with the wider galaxy, and others advocating continued isolation and self-preservation above all else. What remains constant across every surviving branch of Aeldari civilization is the shadow cast by their own history, a species whose brilliance built an empire beyond the comprehension of nearly every civilization that followed it, and whose excess destroyed that empire just as thoroughly. Their present existence, scattered, diminished, and perpetually wary, stands as a continuing consequence of choices made long before their current populations were born, a lesson written across 10 millennia in the ruins of worlds their ancestors once called home. The Aeldari endure not because their strength has been restored, but because their discipline, however imperfect, has proven sufficient to hold back a final collapse that came perilously close to erasing them entirely.